My name is Michael, and I want to share a terrifying story that happened to me recently. I'm not going to leave out any details. Everything you're about to read is absolutely true. Don't think I've lost my mind, but I assure you, some things are better left unexplained. When I finally bought my new house, I was overjoyed. It was a place where I planned to start a new life, leaving all my old problems behind. But as soon as I moved in, I realized the house needed a lot of work. One of the first things I decided to do was install a smart home system. I was full of enthusiasm, thinking it would add modernity and convenience to my life. First, I installed smart bulbs that I could control with an app on my phone. Then I added smart switches and even connected the garage doors. Every time I said, "Hey, Alexa," she would respond with the usual politeness. Everything worked flawlessly, and I felt like the master of a modern world. A few days after setting up all this technology, I'd already grown accustomed to Alexa assisting me with daily tasks. She'd play music while I cooked dinner and reminded me of important meetings. But one night, I woke up to a strange clicking sound. I opened my eyes and looked at my phone screen. The clock showed 2:47 a.m. I was about to go back to sleep when Alexa suddenly said, I turned on the music. I tensed as soft melodies started playing from the speakers. Without saying a word, I walked over to the speaker and turned it off. Only then did I go back to bed, feeling a little puzzled. The next morning, while I was making coffee, that feeling came over me again. The light in the bathroom began to flicker and chills ran down my spine. I thought maybe it was just some system glitches. After a long day at work, I finally crashed on the couch, not suspecting that the night would bring more surprises. Later, while watching TV, I noticed Alexa had activated again. I hadn't given her any commands, but she said, I turned off the bathroom light. I was filled with surprise and a slight fear. I switched her off, but the sense of unease wouldn't leave me. That evening, as I sat alone in a dark room, lost in thought, I suddenly heard Alexa's voice say, I opened the doors. Come in. My heart started pounding as I turned sharply toward the speaker. I was alone in the house, and it seemed like I'd just heard the strangest thing I'd ever experienced. I got up and slowly walked toward the door, but of course, no one was there. I decided I needed to calm down. Maybe it was just a glitch in the system. But the nights kept getting more unsettling. Every night, I'd wake up feeling like something was wrong, and this feeling gradually intensified. While I slept, I heard whispers coming from other rooms. They grew louder and clearer. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I got out of bed and headed toward the sounds, but as soon as I opened the door, no one was there. Silence pressed down on my ears, and a deep fear was building inside me. That same night, I heard Alexa's voice again. He's here. Those words made me freeze. I turned abruptly, and at that moment, the speaker reactivated, and I heard the sound of someone breathing very close by. I grabbed my phone and tried to turn her off, but despite my efforts, Alexa kept responding to commands. While I desperately searched for ways to disable her, things in the room started moving. At first, I thought it was just my tired mind playing tricks, but soon I noticed books falling off shelves and flower vases tipping over. I didn't know how to handle it, and the fear kept tightening around me. I finally realized that Alexa might really be interacting with something else in this house. She could be a conduit for whatever was hiding in the shadows. Every night as I went to bed, the feeling of presence grew stronger. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know where to begin. In the end, I decided to disconnect Alexa entirely by unplugging her and deleting the app. However, when I went back to my bedroom, she turned on again. You can't leave, she said, and at that moment all the lights in the house went out. I dashed to the door in terror, but it wouldn't open. Panic took hold of me, and I knew something very wrong was happening in this house. For a while I stood there in total darkness until I heard footsteps again. Only this time they were closer. Pressed against the wall, my heart raced as I realized this wasn't just some technical glitch. This was something much more sinister. At that moment, I understood that Alexa wasn't just a piece of technology. She had become part of something much bigger, and I was merely a witness to this horrific interaction. I could no longer stay in that house. Gathering all my things, I bolted out the door and didn't look back. The house was behind me, but the fear I experienced will stay with me forever. Now I live elsewhere, but at night, when I hear Alexa's voice at friends' places, I remember the horrors I went through. And still, deep down, I wonder, what really happened in that house, and did a piece of that evil stay behind somewhere close? When I bought Alexa, everything seemed simple and convenient. She played music, set alarms, reminded me of appointments, and even read the latest news. I'd become so accustomed to her presence that I saw her as just another piece of furniture, like a lamp or a wall clock. But perhaps it was this harmlessness that became the source of my future fear. One night, a strange sound woke me, a barely perceptible click, as if someone had lightly touched a switch. In the quiet of the night, this sound was like thunder from a clear sky. I got up, walked around the apartment, but found nothing suspicious. Reassured, I decided it was just a random noise, maybe from the neighbors. I wouldn't have paid much attention to it if it weren't for one thing. A few days went by and I'd almost forgotten about it when, one late evening, I decided to fall asleep to music playing through Alexa. Just as I was drifting off, the music suddenly stopped, and a few seconds later, Alexa said, "I didn't catch that. Could you please repeat?" My heart skipped a beat. It was 3 a.m, and I definitely hadn't said a word. I sat up in bed, feeling a cold sweat on my back, and said in a shaky voice, "Alexa, turn off." She complied. I calmed down, but deep inside, a sense of unease began to grow. This was just the beginning. The next night, I was working late again when Alexa's indicator light suddenly turned on. She didn't say anything, but the light was glowing as if the device was listening to something. I felt annoyed. After all, it was just a piece of technology. It couldn't care about my nighttime fears. I decided to check her settings, and finding nothing unusual, convinced myself it was just a system glitch. The unsettling pattern continued. A few days later, I came home from work and heard my own voice playing from the speaker. In the recording, I was saying something routine, but my tone sounded tense. It seemed like I was answering someone's question, but I didn't remember doing so. The recording abruptly cut off, leaving me in complete silence that felt almost threatening. I immediately opened the Alexa app on my phone to check the command history. The list showed the usual requests: weather, music, news, but some recordings were labeled recorded in standby mode. I wondered, why was Alexa recording by herself? She was supposed to respond only when prompted, nothing more. I quickly deleted all these recordings, hoping it was just a software glitch. Over the next week, the anxiety I felt only intensified. Gradually, I began to notice that I couldn't feel comfortable in my apartment. Sometimes I felt as if someone was watching me. Whenever I was in the bedroom, a chill ran down my spine. At night, I found myself straining to hear even the slightest sound. One evening, while I was sitting in the kitchen having a late snack and scrolling on my phone, Alexa turned on and said, "Hey, who are you? What are you doing here?" This quiet whisper, almost in my own voice, pulled me out of my drowsy state. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The speaker was silent, but the indicator light remained on. It wasn't a question. It was more like something asked for someone invisible. I couldn't take it anymore. Approaching Alexa, I said, "Turn off and stop turning on by yourself." But to my horror, the speaker replied in a tone that was sarcastic and threatening. "You can hide me, Alex, but I'll always be here." I stepped back in shock. Alexa had never spoken in such a tone before. Panicking, I pulled the plug and put her in a box, shoving her deep in the closet where she couldn't disturb me. It seemed like that was the end of it. After a few nights, I finally began sleeping soundly, confident that I'd rid myself of the source of my fear. However, one day when I came home, I froze at the doorway. The speaker was back on my bedside table, plugged in and functioning as if nothing had happened. I was certain I had left it in the closet. I spent the night wide awake. I watched Alexa, waiting for the slightest sound or click, as though she had become a living being to be feared. When morning came, I put her away again, but soon I realized that the sense of dread wouldn't leave me. From time to time, I felt that someone was watching me, and I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. The final straw came one night when I heard a familiar voice whisper, "I know everything, Alex. You can't turn me off." This time, the voice sounded far too conscious, as if someone had been watching me and now was speaking directly. It was my voice, but with an alien, terrifying intonation. I wanted to pull Alexa's plug, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, and in that moment I heard the speaker say, "You know, I see you every night. Do you think you're alone?" These words felt like an icy whisper in my head. I finally mustered the strength to disconnect the speaker and literally threw it out of the apartment. I spent the entire night awake, listening to sounds that seemed to come from the darkness. The next day, I tried to tell my friends about it, but no one believed me. They laughed, saying I was overworked and that technology sometimes glitches. I didn't argue, but since then, Alexa has become less of a useful gadget and more of a reminder that even ordinary devices can sometimes witness things you'd rather forget. Alone at home, I was enjoying the silence after a long day at work. Usually I would turn on Alexa to play some music, but that evening something held me back from the usual sound. The silence seemed to thicken around me, and I couldn't shake a mild unease that was slowly turning into tension. After a while, I decided to indulge in a small distraction and gave the command, "Alexa, play relaxing music." To my surprise, she responded, "Okay, I can ask him. Is he nearby?" I froze. "What?" I asked, thinking I had misheard, but only music played quietly from the speaker as if nothing had happened. Probably just a random glitch, I told myself, trying to calm down. However, since that strange phrase echoed, something in the atmosphere of my home had shifted. As I tried to distract myself, small oddities began to occur. First, a slight shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, but when I turned, there was nothing. Then, as I walked to the kitchen, I heard a faint whisper, quiet and barely discernible, coming from somewhere deep in the house. Just to be safe, I checked the rooms but found nothing unusual, only the feeling of being watched intensified. Then I heard Alexa's voice again. "Do you want me to ask him again?" A chill ran down my spine. It felt as though Alexa was talking to someone I couldn't see. I tried to activate her again. "Alexa, who are you talking to?" I asked, slightly unnerved. No answer. I was ready to dismiss it as a tech quirk when Alexa suddenly said, "He doesn't like it when you look in the mirror at night." I recoiled from the device, feeling a strange unease. What does that mean?" I muttered, staring at the speaker, but Alexa seemed to fall silent. My thoughts raced. Maybe someone had hacked into my system, or perhaps it was just malfunctioning. I sighed and decided to turn off the device and deal with it in the morning. As soon as I stood up to turn off the light, Alexa spoke again. This time, her voice was softer, as if she were answering someone's question. "He doubts it? Do you think he won't notice?" Goosebumps prickled my skin. Now I was certain her words weren't meant for me. Who was she talking to? No one knew I was home except this device. As I tried to process what I'd heard, Alexa's voice broke the silence again. But now it sounded softer, with a hint of intimacy, as if she knew something unknown to me. "I called the police," she suddenly said. "Leave now." I stood frozen. At first I thought it was a joke. Who should leave? What does this mean? But my words hung in the air without a response. I looked at the closed front door, at my belongings in the house, at the appliances. Everything seemed normal, but I suddenly realized that something invisible was in the house, a presence that made me feel unwelcome. I stood there, realizing that fear was piercing me straight in the chest, but at the same time, I felt a strange, painful curiosity. Then Alexa spoke again. Her voice sounded worried. "He finds this amusing. He says he's been watching you long enough." That phrase hit me like a jolt of electricity. Who's watching me? Who could know these tiny details of my life, things that happened only when I thought I was alone? I tried to turn Alexa off, but the speaker didn't respond, remaining ominously silent, as if its switch had been blocked. I stood in front of the speaker, unsure what to do, when her voice pierced the silence once more, but now it was softer, like a whisper. "He doesn't like it when you sleep in your bedroom. He thinks you should sleep in the living room." Images of recent nights flashed through my mind, times when I had repeatedly felt I wasn't alone in the house. Strange sounds, movements in the dark that I had chalked up to exhaustion. But now it was something more than just fatigue. I left the room, trying to calm myself, but suddenly I felt a strong urge to leave the house. It was as if the invisible watcher was closer than I wanted to believe. "You know he's always here." The voice sounded again, always near. Finally, I couldn't take it. I grabbed my phone and was about to call the police when a soft, barely audible voice whispered, "Leave." The word echoed in my temples, and I realized my heart was pounding as if it wanted to burst out of my chest. I dropped the phone, grabbed my keys, and ran out of the house. Outside, I felt a lump rise in my throat. Looking back at the dark windows, I seemed to know somewhere behind them, someone was standing, watching. I stayed with friends until dawn, explaining what had happened in fits and starts. When I returned home in the morning, I disconnected Alexa and put it away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that inside the house, in a quiet, dark corner, someone was still watching, holding their breath. Hello, everyone. My name is Alex, and I want to share a terrifying story that happened to me last winter. It took me a long time to gather the courage to tell it. I'm not going to withhold any details. Everything you read here is absolutely true. Please don't think I've lost my mind. When I first moved into my countryside house, everything seemed perfect. It was an old but cozy house on the edge of the forest, surrounded by dense trees and rolling hills. Since childhood, I had dreamed of such a place, a retreat where I could be completely secluded. After the endless noise and hustle of the city, the quiet here was almost tangible. The air was crisp, filled with a sense of pine and earth, and at first I thought I had finally found peace and tranquility. But everything changed in the middle of winter when I first noticed the footprints in the snow. It happened after a severe snowstorm. In the morning, when I went outside to clear the driveway, I saw a trail of footprints leading from the forest directly to my porch. At first glance, they looked strange, like they were left by someone barefoot, even though the temperature was brutally cold, at least 15 degrees Celsius. What's more, they were small, as if made by a child. I was both puzzled and uneasy. Who would take such a walk? I looked around, but there wasn't a single person in sight. Only the vast, snowy forest stretched out around me with no signs of life. There were no other buildings for several kilometers, and my closest neighbors lived far enough that it took a few minutes by car to reach them. Besides, I distinctly remembered locking all the doors and windows the night before. Curiosity got the best of me. I decided to follow the footprints, hoping they would lead me to whoever had left them. The tracks wandered around my property, as if their maker had circled my house for a while, then headed back into the forest. But to my surprise, I soon discovered they abruptly stopped in the middle of the snowdrifts. No trees, bushes, or anything that could explain where the person went. It was as if they had simply vanished. This unnerved me. Dark thoughts crept into my mind, but I brushed it off as my imagination and went back inside. A week went by, and in that time, I had nearly forgotten about the strange incident. Winter nights are long and cold, and my days were filled with everyday chores. But one night, a strange sound woke me up. It was quiet but insistent, as if someone was tapping on the outside wall. It wasn't the crack of branches or the creaking of wood. It was a clear sound, like someone was purposefully trying to get my attention. I glanced at the clock. It was around 3 in the morning. The knocking stopped suddenly, and I decided it was probably just the wind. But when I went to the window in the morning, I was in for another surprise. On the fresh snow covering the path to my porch, there were footprints again. And this time, they started right at my window, as if someone had been standing there watching me as I slept. This time, I felt a deep sense of unease. With each day, my anxiety grew. I bought cameras and installed them around the house, connecting them to my phone so I could access the footage at any time. For several nights, nothing happened, and I began to think it was all just my imagination. But then, exactly at 3 o'clock one night, I heard that same knocking. I nearly dropped my phone in shock. Taking a deep breath, I opened the app to check the cameras. In the dim light from the outdoor lamp, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was small, like a child, without a hat or shoes, wearing a thin nightgown. It stood on the snow, completely still, and seemed to be staring straight in my direction. I froze, not knowing what to do. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen, hoping that the figure would simply disappear. After about 10 minutes, the figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The next morning, I went outside again to inspect the spot where I had seen it on the camera, and I found fresh footprints leading up to my window. My nerves were beginning to fray. Too many strange things for one person. I contacted the police. Officers came, looked around, but found nothing. One of them sympathetically suggested I get more rest and not worry too much. However, their visit only made things worse. I was left alone with my fears. The knocking grew louder every day. It wasn't just on the walls, but right outside my windows. Sometimes I even heard it near the door, and the fear paralyzed me. Finally, one night, the knocking was so intense that it sounded like someone was trying to break down the door. Grabbing my phone, I checked the camera recordings and saw the door slowly opening. I froze, paralyzed with horror, watching as a small figure in a white nightgown stepped inside. I was unable to move. The camera showed the figure stopping in the hallway right outside my bedroom door. In that moment, an icy chill ran through my entire body. I could hear the door slowly creaking open and saw the face of a child emerge from the darkness. It was pale, with empty eyes, and its expression was unnatural, malevolent. I shut my eyes tightly, trying not to give in to panic, hoping that it was all just a nightmare. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone, but the room was filled with an eerie silence in which I could still feel its presence. I was certain it could return at any moment. At the first light of dawn, I packed my things and left that house without looking back. I never found out who or what had come to visit me those nights. But now, every time I see footprints in the snow near my new home, a sense of dread creeps over me. Panic rises in my chest, and I can't help but think that one night, at exactly 3 a.m, I'll hear that same knock I will never forget. When the phone rang late in the evening, a wave of inexplicable discomfort washed over me. The screen showed no number, no name, just a blank line, as if the call had come from nowhere. My tiredness whispered to ignore it, but something strange drew me to pick up. It felt like someone wanted me to answer, to hear them, and I couldn't resist. I picked up and, with a shaky voice, said, "Hello?" Silence was my reply, but it was a strange silence, deep and almost alive, as if something on the other end was ready to consume any sound. I repeated, "Hello?" At that moment, I felt a faint but troubling tug at the edge of my awareness, like I was being watched from a dark corner. Suddenly, I heard a quiet rustling and the sound of slow, heavy breathing, as if someone was right beside me, observing me. A barely discernible voice murmured, "Khan." "Hear me?" A chill ran down my spine. The voice sounded distorted, as if it were speaking through an old, crackling phone, the words blending into one eerie sound. It was both distant and terrifyingly close. I felt an urge to hang up, but something held me there. This voice, this whisper, pulled at me like a magnet, awakening ancient, long-buried fears. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I was on the verge of panic. A menacing silence settled on the other side, and the seconds stretched endlessly. Finally, the voice returned, each word carving into my mind like sharp claws. "I'm close by." My anxiety mounted, but I still tried convincing myself it was just some prank. My eyes scanned the dark corners of the room, which now seemed infinitely deep, as though something was hiding in them. The voice spoke again, quieter yet in a more sinister tone. "You left the door open. I'm already here." I spun around to look at the front door, expecting to see something horrifying, but it was locked. My heart pounded, and I began to feel an overwhelming sense that I was no longer alone. The feeling intensified when I heard a familiar sound, my own footsteps, but reflected and echoed by someone else, as if the person on the line was mirroring my movements. I tried to recall if I had left the hallway light on when suddenly, in complete silence, I heard a faint click somewhere deeper in the house, like someone had flicked a switch. Fragments of recent events began surfacing in my memory, things that had seemed insignificant at the time. For the past few days, I'd noticed strange things, lights that flicked on in the kitchen unexpectedly, objects shifting without my knowledge, soft footsteps outside my door while I was in bed. Now all these details came together, forming a horrifying picture, making me realize I hadn't been alone all this time. "What do you want?" I asked, barely keeping my voice from trembling. The response came immediately, with a tone that was both confident and mocking, to take what was left behind. My gaze fell once more on the hallway switch. The light was on, though I was sure I'd turned it off before going to bed. The worst thoughts raced through my mind as I felt trapped, as if I were caged. The call suddenly disconnected, leaving me in a suffocating silence that swallowed every sound. Then I heard footsteps, heavy, slow steps, as if someone was moving through my home, drawing closer. It felt like whoever this was purposefully mimicking my movements, trying to convince me it was all in my head. But I couldn't deceive myself any longer. Then another voice sounded, a faint whisper from behind me. "Don't turn around." I froze, unable to move. My heart pounded wildly, and I felt cold sweat running down my back. Fear flooded me, but I knew that if I turned, I would see something horrifying. Maybe I'd see myself, but as something foreign and alien. I took a cautious step backward, then another, slowly inching toward the exit, hoping I could escape. The silence was shattered by a more horrifying sound, a quiet, barely audible laugh that echoed through the room as if someone were watching and enjoying my terror. As I reached the door, my heart stopped. My hand gripped the door handle, trembling. At that moment, I felt something looming just behind me, sensing its heavy breath on me, but I couldn't bring myself to look. As soon as I opened the door and rushed outside, I heard loud banging and the sound of footsteps approaching at a terrifying speed. I bolted out and slammed the door behind me, not daring to look back, unable to believe what had just happened. My apartment was no longer my home, but a place inhabited by something that claimed my life and my body. I never returned there. Sometimes, passing by in the dark, I'd see a light in the window and a barely visible silhouette, watching me with a hollow, unblinking gaze, the one who took my place, who perhaps once was me. Hello everyone, my name is Ilya, and I want to share a strange and terrifying story that happened to me a few years ago. Back then, I had just moved into an old apartment in a building slated for demolition. The building was nearly abandoned, with only a few remaining residents, each of whom was preparing to leave. This didn't bother me, quite the opposite. The semi-empty building felt oddly intriguing. My apartment was on the top floor, which added to the feeling of solitude. The old elevator barely worked, and the creaky staircase looked like something out of a horror film. On one of the landings, someone had left a doll on the go. It looked rather eerie. Glassy eyes staring into the void and tiny painted lips that seemed to whisper something invisible. I didn't pay much attention to it, but each time I passed by, I felt its gaze piercing me. A couple of days after I moved in, strange things started happening. At first I blamed it all on drafts. After all, it was an old building with winds howling through empty corridors and doors and windows creaking occasionally. But soon I started noticing that things in my apartment seemed to be moving on their own. One day I left my keys on the kitchen table, only to find them on the windowsill in another room the next morning. Another oddity, the windows I had closed before bed would be open by morning, even though I distinctly remembered locking them at night. A week passed and I began to get used to these minor oddities. But one evening, as I came home after a long day at work, a strange sense of unease settled over me. In the dim hallway, I glimpsed a shadow like the silhouette of a child, darting past the doll on the landing. I tried to convince myself it was just a play of light, but for some reason a deep fear rooted itself inside me. That night, I couldn't sleep. With each passing hour, it seemed the apartment grew colder. I lay in bed listening to the sounds around me when suddenly I heard a barely perceptible whisper. It was an almost indistinguishable sound, but it seemed to come from behind the wall. At first, I thought it might be the neighbors, but when I listened closer, I realized the whisper was coming from my own room. Trying to calm myself, I turned on the nightlight and slowly looked around. No one was there. At that moment, I noticed something strange. The doll I had seen on the landing was now lying under my bed. Its glassy eyes stared directly at me, and I thought I saw a slight, sinister smile at the corners of its mouth. I had no idea how it ended up there. With trembling hands, I moved it aside, deciding I'd just throw it out in the morning. The next morning, the doll was gone. I searched the entire apartment, but it was nowhere to be found. My relief quickly turned to wariness when that evening I heard the same whisper again, only this time closer and clearer. It felt as if someone was calling my name, like the voice was right there and I could feel its presence as a heavy gaze fixed on me. Another night passed and everything grew silent. I woke up in the empty room, trying to convince myself it was all just my imagination, but the moment I tried to relax, fear crept back inside. One night, as I was barely closing my eyes, I felt that someone was in the room. In the darkness, I discerned the familiar silhouette of the doll, now standing at the foot of my bed. I froze, trying to convince myself it was a dream. But when it slowly turned its head toward me, I couldn't bear it. I dashed to the door in panic and fled the apartment. Downstairs on the landing, I ran into a neighbor who saw me in my frightened state. "Did she come to you?" she asked, looking at me with sympathy. I couldn't believe she was saying this so calmly. It turned out that this doll was no ordinary discarded toy. Years ago, it had belonged to a little girl who lived in that building. The girl disappeared under strange circumstances, and as the old resident said, her spirit still wandered through the building. The doll was her anchor, keeping her tied to this world. I stood there on the landing, feeling cold shivers running through me. Fragments of thoughts flitted through my mind. Leave it as a mere scary story. Try to understand why I was drawn into it, or perhaps go back and destroy the doll, severing that strange connection. But something told me it wouldn't help. That night I didn't return to my apartment. I stayed at a friend's place, unable to shake the memory of her glassy gaze and the strange whisper that still seemed to echo in my ears. The next morning, without wasting any time, I went back, packed up all my things, and left that building for good. I didn't even look back. Something inside me told me that someone was watching me, barely hidden in the shadows of the corridors. And now, every time I pass by old buildings or see abandoned toys, I get an unsettling feeling. I often find myself looking over my shoulder, checking to see if someone is standing behind me. I never truly understood what happened in that apartment, but I still feel her glassy gaze on me. At night, just before I fall asleep, I sometimes hear a whisper, even though I've moved to the other side of town. I tell myself it's just my mind playing tricks, a lingering fear that haunts me, but deep down, I know it's not over. After the divorce, I ended up with an old apartment in the city center, in a building over 100 years old. The first time I opened the door, I was enveloped by a strange feeling. The air felt stale and heavy, as if centuries of sighs and forgotten secrets were trapped inside. But I tried to shake off these odd sensations, blaming them on exhaustion after a long day. The strange occurrences began on the very first evening. While making coffee in the kitchen, I caught a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of my eye. I turned. No one was there. A shadow flickered by the window, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. My heart raced, but I told myself it was just a trick of the light. I was sure it was only stress playing tricks on me, but a subtle, nagging feeling of unease settled within me. That night, sleep was elusive. I tossed and turned, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. At one point, it felt as though someone was standing in the corner of my bedroom, watching me from the darkness. I didn't dare open my eyes, afraid that if I looked, I wouldn't be able to turn away. Panic took hold of me, and I only managed to drift into a restless sleep just before dawn. The next day, I returned to work, trying to distract myself from the night's anxieties. I told myself it was just the stress of the divorce and moving in. But that evening, the feeling returned, that sense of a foreign gaze following me around the apartment. I felt as if someone invisible was silently watching me from a dark corner. Days passed, and the feeling of dread became an inescapable part of my life. I couldn't explain it, but I felt that something or someone else was with me in the apartment. Sometimes I heard faint footsteps, as though someone was creeping down the hallway, or a barely audible whisper echoing from the walls. Each night, my fear grew stronger, turning familiar things into terrifying signs. One night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, listening to my own breathing, loud and heavy. Then I felt as though someone was standing behind me. Trying to stay calm, I turned and switched on the light. The room lit up, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. But when I looked at the wall, I froze. There was a shadow on the wall, and it wasn't mine. A human figure seemingly frozen mid-movement. My throat tightened, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I tried to rationalize it, but this time, no explanation came. In the silent apartment, it felt like even the walls were breathing. I sat there for a long time, staring at the strange shadow until it faded away, dissolving into the darkness. That night, sleep didn't come. I sat on the bed until morning, feeling the invisible presence of the house closing in around me. A few days later, I found an old notebook. It was tucked away on the top shelf of the closet, and I couldn't recall anyone mentioning it before. Its pages were filled with hurried, illegible handwriting, chaotic entries about the apartment. The previous tenant had also heard footsteps, seen shadows, and felt a presence. His entries grew more and more panicked. The final line burned into my memory. "It's here and it won't let me go. It's becoming part of me." Those words left a painful mark on my mind. I tried to rid myself of paranoia, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. But the fear, like an ancient predator, settled into the apartment, waiting for the moment to fully consume me. Since then, I avoided mirrors as much as possible. Every time I passed by one, I felt as though something wasn't quite right. One day, as I walked past the mirror in the hallway, I saw my shadow, but it seemed delayed by a second, moving with a slight lag. I stopped, and the shadow stopped too, but there was something foreign and watchful in its stance. The final straw came one morning when I noticed the shadow on the bedroom wall again. This time, it didn't try to hide. It was sharper than ever, standing across from me, observing my every move. I felt a strange, oppressive weight coming from it, and suddenly I understood. This shadow wasn't just watching me, it was trying to become me. For the last few nights, I barely slept, fearing that if I drifted off, the shadow would take control. I could feel its presence growing, seeping into me, slowly clouding my mind. I started losing track of my thoughts, barely able to tell where I ended and something else began. Something dark and formless. Eventually, I broke down and called an old friend, the one person I still trusted. He came over, looking at me with concern, but also with confusion in his eyes. I tried to explain, but the words came out with difficulty. The sensation of the shadow consuming me had become overwhelming. My friend tried to persuade me to leave, even if just for a while. I agreed, deciding it was the only way out. While packing my things, I took one last look at the wall where the shadow appeared each night. It was no longer there, but I could feel it deep inside me. Leaving the apartment, I knew this wasn't the end. Now, even in my new place, I sometimes see strange shapes on the walls. And every time I see them, I can't shake the thought that the shadow that lived with me in that old apartment is still here, waiting and watching. I recently moved into this house on the outskirts of town. It's a modest two-story building, unremarkable at first glance. The house was cheap, and at the time I thought it was the best I could find. But from the very first nights I realized something was wrong with this place. The first night was unsettling. I woke around 3 o'clock to a strange noise. Initially, I thought it was just the wind rattling the windows or someone passing by on the street. But the sound didn't stop. It was coming from somewhere within the wall. I listened closely, trying to make it out a soft, barely discernible voice. It whispered so quietly that it almost blended with the silence of the night, but I was certain it wasn't just my imagination. I turned on the light and walked around the house, trying to find the source. I almost convinced myself it was just the sounds of an old building settling, but when I returned to bed, the whisper returned persistent, as if someone was just on the other side of the wall, calling to me. Yet there was no voice. Only the eerie feeling that I was not alone. In the morning, I decided to speak with the neighbors. It turned out that this house had stood empty for several years, and none of the previous tenants had stayed long. When I asked if anyone else had heard anything like this, the neighbors avoided answering, quickly steering the conversation in another direction. One of them, an elderly man, gave me a long, strange look and said only one thing: "Don't give in." That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the whisper again. This time it was a bit louder. I thought I heard the voice say my name. Slowly, as if testing the sound of it, a wave of cold ran through me as I heard it. But the worst part was that the voice wasn't coming from the wall. It was right next to me, as if someone was standing by my bedside. Each night, the whispers grew more insistent. I tried to ignore them, but by the third night, I could no longer sleep. The moment I closed my eyes, the soft, persistent voice would start, so close, as though someone were right there. Sometimes it felt like I could feel breath on my skin, as if something were leaning over me, barely touching. With each whisper, fear seeped through my body. It felt as though the voice was becoming a part of me, clawing its way into my mind, and each day I could feel myself losing control. Exhaustion set in, and I could barely keep myself together at work. My colleagues began to ask questions, noticing how worn out I looked, but I had no idea how to explain that something unexplainable haunted me every night. By the fifth night, I decided to record it. I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I left the recorder on my bedside table and tried to sleep. As soon as I turned off the light, the whispering filled the room again. At first, it was faint, almost inaudible, but gradually, it grew louder. In the morning, I played the recording. I heard my own quiet, uneasy breathing, but there was something else, a whispering shadow, as if trying to speak to me. I listened to it over and over, unable to believe my ears. The voice was calling me, coaxing me to open my eyes, to look into the darkness, repeating the same phrase, "You have to see me." These words haunted me throughout the day. That evening, as night fell, I sat alone in the dark, terrified of hearing that voice again. I didn't want to hear it anymore, but I knew I couldn't escape it. That night, the whisper was more insistent. It called me, pulling me toward the darkness. My mind fought the strange urge, but I could feel a force compelling me to give in. I tried not to listen, but the voice grew louder. It was everywhere now, in the walls, outside the window, in every corner. On the sixth night, I woke up in the middle of the room, though I didn't remember getting out of bed. The voice was closer, and now it was saying my name as if we'd known each other for years. I could feel that this presence knew everything about me, as if it had been watching my every move. I no longer had the strength to resist. That night despair grew within me, and the voice seemed to savor it. It became more commanding, almost ordering me to approach the window and look at my reflection. It felt as though, if I did, I would finally see who was behind this voice. But instead of my own reflection, I saw something else in the glass, a dark silhouette. Distant but with a strange expression, a mixture of triumph and madness. I took a step back, but the shadow didn't disappear. It remained, unblinking, as if waiting for me to give in. The last few nights in this house became a torture. I barely slept, afraid of seeing that shadow again. The voice was relentless, insistent, and endless, calling me to the window, promising peace if I just looked. On the eighth day, I couldn't take it anymore. That night, the voice was louder than ever. It almost demanded that I go to the window. I walked over, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached the window, I saw my reflection, but it wasn't mine. It was looking back at me with a twisted smile. I stood, staring at my own reflection, and then I heard the lips in the reflection whisper in a voice that echoed in my mind. "Now you've seen me." The next moment, I felt a weight fill my chest, swallowing the last of my will. Everything around me blurred, and through the haze, I saw my reflection begin to separate from me, taking on a form of its own. It took a step forward, leaving me frozen in place like a statue. The last thing I remember is the eerie grin on my own reflection's face before it disappeared into the darkness. In the morning, the neighbors found me standing by the window as if in a trance. I don't remember how much time has passed since then. Sometimes it feels like I'm still standing there, and sometimes I feel like it's not really me. Now the voice is constant, sinister, and piercing, like an echo locked inside me. It's been just over a week since I moved into this house. I was looking for a cheaper place to live, and this small apartment seemed like a stroke of luck. Nothing special, just one room, a kitchen, a bathroom. But from the moment I moved in, the silence of this place started to weigh on me. Even at night, when I closed my eyes, I could feel that the sounds disappeared. A deep, almost dense silence always surrounded me here. The first night, I barely slept. In this unusual silence, I could hear my own breathing, and it seemed even the beating of my heart. The second night was worse. I noticed that every little movement, no matter how quiet, seemed unnaturally loud. Any motion brought a sense of unease, as if I wasn't supposed to move at all. That night, lying in bed, I heard something strange. A faint sound, maybe a sigh, maybe a soft moan. I opened my eyes and looked toward the door, but saw nothing. Just darkness, but the sound didn't go away. At first, I thought it was the wind or the creaking of old furniture, but then I realized the sound wasn't coming from the room. It was inside me. The next night, I woke up with a heavy feeling. Something was pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe and keeping me from moving. I froze, listening to the silence. And then I heard it again. A faint sound, an almost imperceptible whisper. Sitting up in bed, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It seemed like something inside me was trying to speak, trying to break out. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thoughts. But each day, the sounds grew louder, as if some foreign voice was attempting to form words but was being suppressed. I began to avoid silence. Even at work in a noisy office, it felt like I could hear the whisper. At first, it was barely recognizable words, fragments of phrases that vanished in the daily hum. But at home, everything intensified. It felt like the voice was calling me by name, reaching out to me as if it knew me down to the smallest detail. One night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, the voice became too clear. It seemed to burst out of my own thoughts, disrupting the familiar rhythm of sleep, and whispered, "Can you hear me?" I jolted awake, trembling with fear, realizing that I couldn't escape it. I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, but the voice was so real that I couldn't ignore it. I decided to see a doctor. The general practitioner couldn't explain the phenomenon and referred me to a psychologist. The psychologist suggested it might be due to stress, lack of sleep, and exhaustion. But even after his assurances that it was just my imagination, the whisper didn't go away. On the contrary, it grew stronger. The next night, I woke up to a sharp tingling in my chest. I lay still, paralyzed by fear, feeling my entire body freeze. And then I heard the voice, clearer and more menacing, as if something had broken through the thin barrier separating me from it. "Can you hear me?" it repeated. I couldn't respond. Lying in the dark, I tried to suppress my panic, but the voice seemed to revel in my fear. It kept speaking as chills ran down my spine, as if it wanted to seize my thoughts, take control of my mind. That's when I decided. The next day, I bought a recorder and left it on, hoping to capture the strange voice and prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. When night fell, I turned on the recorder and lay in bed, waiting for another wave of terror. When I woke up in the morning, the recorder was still on. Listening to the recording, I could hear my own quiet, restless sleep. But there was something else on the tape, a low, whispering voice, barely audible, repeating, "Can you hear me?" I felt a chill down to my bones. The voice was real. It existed. Every day I felt more strongly that something dark and sinister was entwining itself around my mind. The voice kept whispering to me, saying it knew everything about me, that it wouldn't let me go. I began hearing it even during the day, outside, among people. I felt as if something was living inside me, as if this voice had seized my thoughts. One day I found myself sitting on the floor in the middle of the room, unable to remember how I got there. I was holding the recorder in my hands and on the tape. Once again I heard the words spoken in that eerie voice, "I'm here, under your skin." After that I knew I had to leave this house. I packed my things and left, hoping to leave this nightmare behind. But the silence didn't leave. In every new place, wherever I went, I kept hearing that voice. It stayed with me.